The blood trail vanished into solid rock, and Ethan Vance watched his best scout curse under his breath for the third time in an hour, realizing they had lost the cattle rustlers who had stolen half his herd in the November darkness. Behind him, a woman's voice cut through the cold morning air like a knife through butter, clear and confident as she announced that the thieves had split up at the canyon mouth. One rider heading north toward the rim rock, while the others drove the cattle west through the dry creek bed. Ethan turned in his saddle to stare at the stranger, who had apparently tracked what his men could not, taking in her dusty riding skirt, worn leather vest, and the way she sat her paint horse like she had been born in the saddle, her dark blonde hair braided down her back beneath a weathered hat. "And who might you be to tell my men their business?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice level despite his frustration at losing the trail and his curiosity about this woman who had appeared out of nowhere on the remote rangeland west of Terlingua, Texas, in the autumn of 1883. "Penelope Mason," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "And I am not telling your men their business. I am telling you where your cattle went because I have been following those same rustlers for 2 days, and they killed my brother when he caught them on our land 3 nights ago." The words hung in the cold air between them, and Ethan saw the grief flash across her face before she locked it away behind a mask of determination. His scout, a grizzled man named Dutch who had tracked for the army during the Apache campaigns, rode forward to examine the area where she had pointed, and after several minutes of careful study, he returned with a grudging nod. "She is right, boss. I can see it now, the way the stone is scuffed here, and there is fresh horse dung in that wash that I missed before." Dutch spit tobacco juice onto the ground and studied Penelope with new respect. "Where did you learn to read sign like that?" "My father was a trapper before he settled down to ranch," Penelope said. "He taught me and my brother everything he knew about tracking, and I have spent most of my 22 years following game and livestock through country far rougher than this." Ethan made a decision, driven by both necessity and the quiet competence he saw in this woman's steady gray eyes. "Miss Mason, I am sorry for your loss. If these are the same men, and I suspect they are since there is not exactly an abundance of organized rustler gangs working this territory, then we want the same thing. My name is Ethan Vance, and this is my land we are standing on. I lost 40 head of prime cattle last night, and I need them back before they are driven across the border into Mexico, where I will never see them again. Can you help us track them?" "I can track them," Penelope said flatly. "The question is whether you can keep up and whether you are willing to do what needs to be done when we catch them." "I have 8 men with me, and we are all armed and ready," Ethan replied. "Lead the way." She did, and Ethan found himself impressed within the first mile as Penelope moved ahead of the group, reading the landscape like a book written in dust and stone. Where Dutch and his other men would have lost the trail a dozen times, she never hesitated, pointing out bent grass stems, disturbed pebbles, and subtle changes in the way the morning light fell across the ground that revealed the passage of cattle and horses hours before. They rode hard through the morning, following the trail west through increasingly rough country, and Ethan used the time to study the woman who had suddenly appeared in his life like an answer to a prayer he had not known he was saying. Penelope Mason sat her horse with an easy grace that spoke of long years in the saddle, and she carried a Winchester rifle in a scabbard on her saddle with the casual familiarity of someone who knew how to use it. Her face was sun-bronzed and weathered, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw that might have been called handsome rather than pretty. But there was something compelling about her features, something in the set of her mouth and the intelligence in her eyes that made it hard for Ethan to look away. She wore men's boots and carried herself with a confidence that suggested she had earned her place in this harsh country through hard work and harder lessons. And Ethan felt a stirring of respect that went beyond mere gratitude for her tracking skills. By noon they had closed the distance significantly, and Penelope held up a hand to halt the group as they topped a ridge overlooking a shallow valley. Below, Ethan could see his cattle being driven toward a narrow canyon entrance by 5 riders, and his jaw tightened with anger at the sight of his stolen property. "They are pushing the herd hard," Penelope said quietly, scanning the valley below. "They want to get through that canyon before dark, which means there must be a buyer waiting on the other side or a hidden canyon where they plan to rebrand the cattle before selling them." "Can we catch them before they reach the canyon?" Ethan asked, already calculating angles and distances. "Not all of us," Penelope said, "but 2 good riders on fast horses could cut across that ridge to the north and come out ahead of them at the canyon mouth. Block the entrance and the cattle will mill around rather than scatter, and the rustlers will have to fight or surrender." "That is a bold plan," Dutch said doubtfully. 2 riders against 5 and all of them armed. "The element of surprise counts for a lot," Penelope replied. "And I have no intention of giving them a fair fight after what they did to my brother." Ethan looked at her and saw the cold determination in her eyes, the kind of resolve that came from personal loss and the need for justice. He had worn that same expression himself more than once in his 30 years, and he recognized a kindred spirit when he saw one. "I will ride with you," he said. "Dutch, you take the men and come in from behind once the shooting starts. Push them toward the canyon mouth and we will have them trapped." "Boss, that is a damn fool plan," Dutch protested. "Begging your pardon, miss, but you are putting yourself and the lady in serious danger." "Miss Mason has already put herself in danger by tracking these men alone for 2 days," Ethan said firmly. "And I trust her judgment. We do this her way." They moved quickly, with Ethan and Penelope breaking away from the main group and pushing their horses hard across the ridge to the north. The sun was past its zenith and starting its slow descent toward the western horizon as they raced across the broken country. And Ethan felt his blood singing with the kind of excitement that came from action after too much waiting. His horse, a big bay gelding named Thunder, stretched out beneath him with powerful strides, and beside him Penelope's paint mare matched the pace with ease, her rider leaning low over the horse's neck to reduce wind resistance. They reached the canyon mouth with perhaps 10 minutes to spare, and Ethan quickly assessed their position. The canyon entrance was narrow, perhaps 20 feet across, with steep rock walls on either side that would funnel the cattle into a natural bottleneck. He and Penelope positioned themselves behind a tumble of boulders that provided cover while still allowing them clear shots at anyone trying to force the herd through the opening. "Have you done this before?" Ethan asked as they checked their rifles and settled into wait. "Tracked rustlers or gotten into a gunfight?" Penelope asked, and there was a hint of dark humor in her voice. "Either. Both. I have tracked plenty of things, animals and men alike," she said. "As for gunfights, I was in one when I was 19. 3 drifters tried to steal horses from our ranch while my father and brother were away at market. I put 2 of them down, and the 3rd one ran." Ethan looked at her with new eyes, seeing not just competence but genuine danger in the woman beside him. "That must have been hard." "It was necessary," Penelope said flatly. "Just like this is necessary. These men murdered my brother in cold blood when he confronted them, shot him down without warning and left him to die alone in the dark. I found him the next morning, and I will not rest until they answer for what they did." The sound of cattle lowing and men shouting drifted toward them on the wind, and Ethan readied his rifle. his heart pounding with anticipation. The herd appeared first, 40 head of cattle moving at a trot with their heads up and eyes rolling white with stress, and behind them came the 5 riders, pushing the animals hard toward the canyon entrance. "Wait until they are committed to the opening," Penelope whispered. "Once they see us and try to turn the herd, Dutch and the others should be coming up behind them." The cattle reached the canyon mouth and began to funnel through the narrow opening, and the riders moved to follow, confident and unsuspecting. Ethan waited until the first 2 men were fully exposed in the opening before he stood up from behind the boulder and called out in a voice that echoed off the canyon walls. "That is far enough. Those are my cattle, and you are all under arrest for rustling." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The lead rider jerked his horse to a stop and reached for his gun, while behind him the other men scattered, trying to wheel their horses around to face this unexpected threat. The cattle, already nervous and pushed beyond their limits, immediately began to mill about in confusion, blocking the canyon entrance and creating chaos. The first shot came from one of the rustlers, a wild shot that ricocheted off stone somewhere to Ethan's left, and then the canyon erupted in gunfire. Ethan fired carefully, aiming for the lead rider who had drawn first, and saw the man jerk backward in his saddle before tumbling to the ground. Beside him, Penelope's rifle cracked twice in quick succession, and 2 more rustlers went down with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to place her shots. The remaining 2 riders tried to retreat back the way they had come, but Dutch and the ranch hands appeared behind them, cutting off their escape. Caught between 2 fires and with their comrades down, the rustlers threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender, their faces pale with the realization that their luck had finally run out. The gunfight had lasted perhaps 30 seconds, and in its aftermath, the canyon fell silent except for the nervous bawling of cattle and the ringing in Ethan's ears. He moved carefully from behind the boulder, keeping his rifle trained on the 2 surviving rustlers while his men dismounted and secured the prisoners. "Check the wounded," Ethan ordered, though he suspected it was already too late for the 3 men they had shot. Penelope was already moving forward, her rifle still ready, and she walked directly to the lead rider who lay motionless on the ground. She stood over him for a long moment, looking down at his face, and when she spoke her voice was cold and final. "This is the one who shot my brother. I recognize his horse and his gun belt." She looked up at Ethan with eyes that held both satisfaction and sorrow. "It is done." Dutch confirmed that all 3 of the downed rustlers were dead, and the 2 survivors were tied securely and placed under guard. Ethan's men began the work of settling the cattle and preparing for the journey back to the ranch, and Ethan found himself standing beside Penelope as the sun continued its descent toward the western mountains. "You are a hell of a shot," he said quietly. "And I would not have gotten my cattle back without your help." "I did not do it for your cattle," Penelope replied, but her voice had lost some of its hard edge. "I did it for my brother. I know, but you still helped me and I am grateful." Ethan paused, choosing his words carefully. "What will you do now? Do you have family waiting for you?" Penelope shook her head slowly. "My father died 2 years ago. It was just my brother and me running our ranch, and now it is just me. We have a small spread about 15 miles northeast of here, maybe 300 acres of rough grazing land, and a cabin that needs more work than I can give it alone." An idea had been forming in Ethan's mind since he had first seen Penelope track what his men could not, and now it crystallized into a decision that felt both practical and right. "Miss Mason, I have a proposition for you. Winter is coming, and it is going to be a hard one based on what the old-timers are saying. You should not be alone on a remote ranch trying to survive the cold months by yourself, and I could use someone with your skills. My best scout is getting old and thinking about retiring, and I have 3,000 head of cattle spread across 20,000 acres that need watching. Stay at my ranch through the winter. Help me keep track of my herd and teach some of my younger hands how to read sign the way you do, and I will pay you top wages plus room and board. Penelope turned to look at him fully, and Ethan saw surprise flicker across her face before it was replaced by cautious consideration. You want to hire me as a scout? I want to hire you as my head tracker, Ethan said. Dutch is good, but you are better, and I need the best if I am going to keep my cattle safe from men like these. He gestured toward the dead rustlers. And honestly, I would rest easier knowing you were not alone out there trying to survive the winter by yourself. I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself, Penelope said, but there was less bite in her words than there might have been. I know you are, Ethan agreed, but capable does not mean you should have to do everything alone when there is another option. Think about it at least. You do not have to decide right now. They rode back to the Vance ranch in the fading light, driving the recovered cattle before them and bringing the two surviving rustlers to face justice in Terlingua. The ranch itself was an impressive operation, with a large main house built of adobe and timber, several barns and outbuildings, corrals that could hold hundreds of cattle, and a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. Ethan had built this place from nothing over the past 8 years, starting with a land grant and a handful of cattle, and growing it into one of the most successful ranches in Brewster County through hard work, smart management, and more than a little luck. As they brought the cattle into the holding pens, Ethan's foreman, a capable Mexican man named Rodrigo Sanchez, came out to meet them with a broad smile splitting his weathered face. You got them back. I did not think it was possible, boss, but you did it. Rodrigo's smile faded as he took in the prisoners and noticed Penelope riding beside Ethan. And who is this? This is Miss Penelope Mason, Ethan said. She is the reason we got the cattle back. She can track better than Dutch, better than anyone I have ever seen, and she has accepted my offer to stay on as head tracker for the winter. Penelope shot him a look that suggested she had not actually accepted anything yet, but she did not contradict him in front of his foreman, and Ethan took that as a good sign. Rodrigo welcomed her warmly and immediately began making arrangements for her comfort, directing one of the hands to prepare a room in the main house and another to see to her horse. The bunkhouse is no place for a lady, Rodrigo said firmly, when Penelope suggested she could stay there. The main house has plenty of room, and Senor Vance lives there alone except for Maria, who comes in to cook and clean during the day. You will be comfortable and safe there. Penelope looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion was beginning to show on her face after 2 days of hard riding, and the emotional toll of avenging her brother's death. She finally nodded her acceptance and allowed herself to be led toward the main house, while Ethan dealt with the prisoners and gave instructions for the care of the recovered cattle. By the time Ethan made it back to the main house, full darkness had fallen, and the November cold was settling in with the promise of a hard freeze before morning. He found Penelope in the kitchen, cleaned up and wearing fresh clothes that Maria must have found for her, sitting at the large wooden table with a cup of coffee wrapped in her hands. She looked up when he entered, and for the first time since he had met her, Ethan saw something other than grim determination in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for the offer and for not making me feel like charity." Ethan poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "It is not charity. I meant what I said about needing your skills. Good trackers are worth their weight in gold out here, and you are the best I have seen." I have not actually said yes yet, Penelope pointed out, but there was no heat in her words. I know. But you are here, and you are drinking my coffee, so I figure I have at least gotten you to consider it. Ethan allowed himself a small smile. What would it take to make you say yes? Penelope was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if it held answers to questions she had not yet asked. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. I need to go back to my ranch and settle things there. Sell what can be sold, pack up what I want to keep, make sure the place is secure for the winter. If I am going to be here, I cannot just abandon everything I have. That is fair, Ethan said. I can send some men with you to help with the heavy work. No sense in you trying to do it all yourself. I would appreciate that. Penelope looked up and met his eyes. Why are you doing this? You do not know me and you do not owe me anything. It was a good question, and Ethan took his time answering it, wanting to be honest with both her and himself. I am doing it because it is the right thing to do, and because I meant what I said about needing your skills. But I am also doing it because I have been running this ranch alone for 8 years, and I am tired of being alone. I am not talking about anything improper, he added quickly, seeing her expression shift. I am just saying that having another person around who understands this life and this country, someone I can talk to who is not one of my hands or my foreman, that would be worth more to me than you might realize. Penelope studied him for a long moment, and Ethan had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing right through all his carefully constructed defenses to the loneliness he rarely acknowledged even to himself. Finally, she nodded slowly. All right. I will stay through the winter and work as your head tracker. But I want it understood that I am an employee, not a charity case or a woman who needs protecting. I pull my own weight, and I expect to be treated like any other member of your crew. Agreed, Ethan said, and held out his hand to seal the deal. When Penelope shook it, her grip was firm and calloused, the handshake of someone who worked for a living, and Ethan felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with gaining a good tracker and everything to do with the woman sitting across from him. They spent the next morning dealing with practical matters. The 2 surviving rustlers were turned over to the county sheriff in Terlingua, their confessions and the testimony of Ethan and his men ensuring they would face trial for murder and cattle rustling. Dutch rode with them to give his statement, and when he returned in the afternoon, he sought out Ethan in the ranch office where he was going over the books. That Mason woman is something else, Dutch said without preamble. I have been tracking for 30 years, and she made me look like a blind greenhorn yesterday. Where did you find her? She found us, Ethan replied. And I hired her to be head tracker for the winter, so you will have a chance to learn from her if you are willing. Dutch snorted but looked pleased rather than offended. Hell, boss, I am always willing to learn from someone better than me, and she is definitely better. Just wish I knew how she does it. Why do not you ask her? Ethan suggested. She will be working with you to track the herd and watch for any more rustler activity. Over the following week, Ethan sent 4 men with Penelope back to her ranch to help her settle her affairs, and when she returned, she brought with her several pack horses loaded with personal belongings, tools, and a few pieces of furniture that had belonged to her family. Ethan helped her move everything into the spare room that had been prepared for her, and he found himself studying the items she had chosen to keep. A well-worn Bible that had belonged to her mother, a carved wooden box that held her father's trapping tools, a quilt made by her grandmother, and a small collection of books that suggested an education beyond what most frontier women received. My mother was a teacher before she married my father, Penelope explained when she caught him looking at the books. She believed that learning was just as important as any practical skill, so she taught us to read and write and figure. My brother hated the lessons, but I loved them." "What happened to her?" Ethan asked gently. "Fever took her when I was 12, Penelope said. "It swept through the region and killed dozens of people that winter. My father never really recovered from losing her, I think. He kept going for our sake, but part of him died with her." Ethan understood that kind of loss, though his own grief was different. He had been engaged once, to a woman named Sarah who had promised to come west and marry him as soon as he had established his ranch. But Sarah had changed her mind at the last minute, deciding that life on the frontier was too hard and too dangerous, and she had married a banker in St. Louis instead. Ethan had thrown himself into building his ranch, using work to fill the hole her departure had left, and he had told himself that he was better off alone. But standing in the room with Penelope, watching her arrange her few possessions with careful attention, he felt the stirrings of something he had thought long dead. Winter came early that year, with the first serious snow falling in mid-December and covering the rangeland in a blanket of white that transformed the harsh landscape into something beautiful and alien. Penelope proved her worth immediately, working with Dutch and the other hands to track the cattle as they moved across the winter range in search of forage, identifying potential problems before they became serious, and teaching the younger men how to read the subtle signs that indicated where animals had passed and where they were heading. Ethan found himself watching her more than was probably proper, admiring the way she moved through the snow with a sure-footed grace, the way she explained tracking techniques with a patience that suggested she had learned the value of good teaching from her mother, the way she laughed at the rough jokes the cowboys told around the evening fire without blushing or taking offense. She fit into the ranch community as if she had always been there, earning the respect of the men through her skills and her willingness to work as hard as anyone else. But it was the evenings that Ethan treasured most, the times when the work was done and he and Penelope would sit in the main house and talk over coffee, or, when the cold was particularly bitter, whiskey. They talked about everything and nothing, their pasts and their hopes for the future, books they had read and places they had seen, the challenges of making a life in a country that was beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Ethan found himself opening up to Penelope in ways he had not done with anyone in years, telling her about his broken engagement and the loneliness that had driven him to build something so ambitious in such a remote location. "I think you were running away," Penelope said one evening in late December as they sat before the fireplace in the main room, watching flames dance across split logs. "Not from Sarah, but from the life she represented. You did not want to be a banker or a shopkeeper or anything tame. You wanted something wild and free, even if it meant being alone." "Maybe," Ethan admitted, "but I am not sure being alone is what I wanted or if it is just what I ended up with." "There is a difference," Penelope agreed. "I never wanted to be alone, but after my father died and it was just me and my brother, I learned how to be. And after my brother died, I thought that was just how my life would be. Alone but capable, surviving but not really living. And now?" Ethan asked, his heart beating faster as he waited for her answer. "Now I am not sure," Penelope said softly. "Being here, working with your men, having people to talk to and share meals with, I realize how much I have been missing. And talking with you these evenings, I realize there are different kinds of alone. You can be surrounded by people and still be lonely, or you can be with just one person and feel completely whole." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities, and Ethan felt himself leaning slightly toward her, drawn by something deeper than mere attraction. But before he could speak or act on the impulse, Penelope stood up abruptly and announced she was tired and going to bed, and the moment passed like smoke on the wind. Christmas came and went with a celebration in the bunkhouse that involved too much food, too much drink, and a general atmosphere of warmth and camaraderie that made Ethan grateful for his men and the community they had built. Penelope surprised everyone by revealing she could play the fiddle, an instrument she had brought from her family ranch, and she led the gathered cowboys in songs that ranged from sentimental ballads to bawdy drinking songs that had everyone laughing and stomping their feet. Ethan stood back and watched her play, her face flushed with warmth and happiness, and he felt something shift permanently inside his chest. This was not mere attraction or the kind of desperate loneliness that made any woman seem appealing. This was something real and deep and terrifying in its intensity. He was falling in love with Penelope Mason, and he had no idea if she felt the same way. The answer came in mid-January, during one of the worst blizzards Ethan had seen in years. The snow had been falling for 2 days straight, piling up in drifts that reached the windowsills of the main house and making it impossible to venture far from the buildings. Ethan had been worried about some of the cattle that had been grazing in a far pasture, and despite the weather, he made plans to ride out with Dutch and 2 other men to check on them. Penelope caught him in the barn as he was saddling Thunder, her face set with determination. "You are not going out there without me." "It is too dangerous," Ethan protested. "The visibility is almost zero and the cold is brutal." "Which is exactly why you need your best tracker with you," Penelope countered. "If you get disoriented in the storm, I can get you back here safely." "Dutch is good, but I am better, and you know it." She was right, and Ethan knew it, but the thought of putting her in danger made his stomach clench with fear. When had her safety become more important to him than his own? When had the thought of losing her become more terrifying than the prospect of losing his cattle or even his ranch? "Please," Penelope said, and her voice was softer now. "Let me do what I do best. Let me help you." They rode out into the teeth of the storm. 5 riders wrapped in heavy coats and scarves, hunched against the wind that drove snow into their faces like tiny knives. The world disappeared into a whiteout of swirling snow and howling wind, and within minutes, Ethan had completely lost his sense of direction. But Penelope rode ahead with confidence, somehow reading the landscape, despite the blinding conditions, guiding them unerringly toward the far pasture where the cattle had last been seen. They found the cattle huddled in a small canyon that provided some shelter from the worst of the wind, and Ethan counted heads with relief, finding all 20 of the young steers he had been worried about. But getting them back to the ranch in these conditions would be nearly impossible, so they settled for making sure the animals had access to water from a small spring in the canyon and would be safe until the storm passed. The ride back was even worse than the ride out, with the storm intensifying and the temperature dropping so low that Ethan could feel his fingers and toes going numb despite his heavy gloves and boots. Twice they had to stop when one of the horses stumbled in a hidden snowdrift, and once Dutch's mount nearly went down on a patch of ice hidden beneath the fresh snow. Through it all, Penelope rode at the front of the group, never hesitating, never wavering, leading them back toward the ranch with a certainty that bordered on supernatural. When they finally stumbled into the barn, all 5 riders were shaking with cold and exhaustion. Ethan's hands were so numb he could barely unbridle his horse, and it was Penelope who helped him, her own hands steady despite the brutal conditions they had just endured. Dutch and the other men hurried toward the bunkhouse and the warmth waiting there, but Ethan and Penelope walked together toward the main house, neither of them speaking as they fought their way through wind and snow. Inside, Ethan built up the fire while Penelope made coffee, and they sat together in silence for a long time, letting the warmth slowly seep back into their bodies. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer contain. "You saved our lives out there. I was completely lost after the first mile, and if you had not been there to guide us back, we would have frozen to death in that storm." "I was just doing my job," Penelope said, but her voice was shaking slightly. "No," Ethan said firmly. "You did far more than any job requires. You risked your life to help me, and I need you to know how much that means to me." He paused, gathering his courage for what he needed to say next. "Penelope, these past months with you here have been the happiest I can remember in years. You have brought life back to this place and to me, and I do not want to think about what it will be like when winter ends and you leave." Penelope set down her coffee cup with a hand that trembled visibly. "Ethan, I do not know what to say." "Then do not say anything yet," Ethan said. "Just know that I have feelings for you, deep feelings that go far beyond gratitude or friendship. And if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, I would like the chance to court you properly and see where this might lead." For a long moment, Penelope just looked at him, her gray eyes searching his face as if trying to read the truth written there. Then, slowly, she reached across the space between them and took his hand in hers, and the touch sent a jolt of warmth through Ethan that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the hearth. "I feel it too," she said quietly. "I have been trying not to, trying to tell myself that I am just grateful for a place to stay and work to do, but the truth is that I have been falling in love with you since that first day when you offered me respect instead of pity. When you asked me to stay, not because you felt sorry for me, but because you valued what I could do." Ethan felt his heart swell with a joy so intense it was almost painful. "So you will let me court you? You will stay past the winter and give us a chance to see what we might build together?" "Yes," Penelope said, and smiled at him with a warmth that rivaled the fire. "Yes, I will stay." The courtship that followed was unlike anything Ethan had experienced before. With Sarah, everything had been formal and structured, conducted according to the social rules of polite society with chaperones and calling hours and all the rigid etiquette of the East. But with Penelope, everything was different. They courted while riding out to check on cattle, while tracking mountain lions that threatened the calves, while working side by side to repair fences damaged by winter storms. They courted over shared meals in the main house and quiet evenings by the fire, over morning coffee and late-night conversations that stretched until dawn. Ethan learned that Penelope loved poetry, particularly the works of Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman, and he began reading to her in the evenings, stumbling over the unfamiliar rhythms until she would laugh and take the book from him to read the verses herself. She learned that he had a gift for working with horses and could gentle even the most fractious animal with patience and kindness, and she watched him work with a respect that made him want to be better than he was. They shared their first kiss in February, on a clear, cold day when they had ridden out together to check on a line shack at the northern edge of the ranch property. The shack was a small one-room structure used by hands during the busy seasons when they needed to stay out with the herd for days at a time, and it was stocked with basic supplies and firewood. They had stopped there to warm up and rest the horses, and Ethan found himself standing close to Penelope as they looked out the small window at the snow-covered landscape stretching away in all directions. "It is beautiful here," Penelope said softly. "Harsh and dangerous, but beautiful." "Like you," Ethan said, and then felt foolish for such a clumsy compliment. But Penelope turned to look at him with eyes that were suddenly very warm, and she reached up to touch his face with a gentleness that made his breath catch. "Ethan Vance, are you comparing me to a snow-covered wasteland?" I am comparing you to something strong and beautiful that takes my breath away," Ethan replied, and then he was kissing her, his arms around her waist and her hands in his hair, and the world disappeared into the warmth of her mouth and the perfect rightness of holding her close. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Penelope rested her forehead against his and whispered, "I love you. I did not want to, did not plan to, but I love you anyway." "I love you too," Ethan said, and felt the words settle into his chest like a warm stone, solid and real and true. "Marry me, Penelope. Not now, not tomorrow, but someday when you are ready. Marry me and stay here and help me build something worth having." "Yes," Penelope said and kissed him again. "Yes, I will marry you." They set the wedding for early May, after the worst of winter had passed, but before the busy season of spring roundup, and branding would consume all their time and energy. Ethan wanted to do things properly, to give Penelope the kind of wedding she deserved even in this remote corner of Texas. So he sent word to Terlingua and arranged for a circuit preacher to come out to the ranch to perform the ceremony. Penelope wore a simple dress of blue calico that Maria helped her sew, and she braided wild flowers into her hair instead of wearing a veil. Ethan wore his best suit, which he had not put on since the day he had signed the papers for his land grant, and he stood before the assembled gathering of ranch hands and a few neighbors from nearby spreads, feeling happier and more nervous than he had ever been in his life. The ceremony was brief and heartfelt, conducted in the main room of the house with the spring sunlight streaming through the windows, and everyone Ethan cared about gathered to witness his marriage to the woman he loved. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife and told Ethan he could kiss his bride, he did so with a tenderness and passion that made several of the cowboys whistle and cheer, and Penelope laughed against his mouth before kissing him back with equal fervor. The celebration that followed was boisterous and joyful, with music and dancing and more food than seemed possible given the remote location. Maria had outdone herself with the cooking, and Rodrigo had contributed several bottles of excellent tequila that he claimed had been in his family for generations. Penelope played her fiddle while Dutch called square dances, and Ethan danced with his bride under the stars, holding her close and thinking that he had never imagined he could be this happy. When the party finally wound down in the early hours of the morning, and the last of the guests had stumbled off to the bunkhouse or their own homes, Ethan carried Penelope over the threshold of their bedroom and set her down gently, his heart pounding with anticipation and love. "Are you happy?" he asked, needing to hear her say it. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Penelope replied, reaching up to pull him down for a kiss. "I love you, Ethan Vance, and I am going to love you for the rest of my life." They made love with a passion and tenderness that spoke of deep connection and genuine affection. And afterward, Ethan held his wife in his arms and listened to her breathing slow into sleep, feeling more content and peaceful than he had ever felt before. This was what he had been missing all those years alone, this sense of completeness and purpose that came from sharing your life with someone who understood you completely. The months that followed their wedding were busy and challenging as they worked together to manage the ranch through the critical spring and summer seasons. Penelope proved to be not just an excellent tracker, but a capable ranch manager, with good instincts for cattle and a knack for solving problems that had Ethan relying on her judgment as much as his own. The men respected her completely now, not just as the boss's wife, but as someone who had earned her place through skill and hard work. And Ethan felt a fierce pride watching her command the same respect he had worked years to achieve. In September, Penelope told him she was pregnant, and Ethan felt a joy so profound it brought tears to his eyes. They would have a child, a son or daughter to carry on what they were building together, and the ranch that had once seemed like a lonely monument to his ambition now felt like a true home, full of love and possibility. Their son was born the following April, during a warm spring rain that washed the desert clean and brought wildflowers blooming across the rangeland. They named him James, after Penelope's brother, and Ethan held his son for the first time with hands that shook with awe and responsibility. The baby was small and red-faced and perfect, with his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair, and Ethan swore silently that he would give this child everything he had never had: a stable home, parents who loved each other and him, and the freedom to choose his own path. Penelope recovered quickly from the birth, and within weeks she was back in the saddle, riding out to check on cattle with James strapped to her back in a cradle board she had fashioned after seeing similar contraptions used by Apache mothers. Ethan worried about her taking such risks with their son, but Penelope just laughed and told him that babies were tougher than people gave them credit for. And James certainly seemed to thrive on the outdoor life, sleeping peacefully through long rides and waking only to nurse or gurgle happily at passing scenery. 2 years later, their daughter was born, a tiny, fierce creature they named Catherine after Ethan's mother. Where James was placid and easygoing, Catherine was demanding and intense from the moment she arrived, crying lustily and keeping her parents up half the night with her insistent needs. But she was also affectionate and bright, learning to talk early and following her older brother around with devoted determination as soon as she could walk. The ranch continued to prosper under their joint management, growing from 3,000 head of cattle to over 5,000, with additional land purchases expanding their range to nearly 30,000 acres. Ethan built a larger house to accommodate their growing family, with separate bedrooms for the children and a proper office where he and Penelope could handle the increasing paperwork that came with running a major ranching operation. Dutch finally retired in 1890, handing over his duties to a young man named Samuel, who had learned tracking from both Dutch and Penelope, and who showed real promise. The old scout stayed on at the ranch in a small cabin Ethan built for him near the main house, spending his days carving, smoking his pipe, and telling increasingly elaborate stories to James and Catherine about his adventures during the Apache campaigns. In 1892, Penelope gave birth to their third child, another son they named Thomas. He was the largest of their babies, with his father's build and his mother's fierce spirit, and from the beginning, he showed an intense interest in horses that suggested he would follow in Ethan's footsteps as a horseman. By the time Thomas was walking, he was toddling after his father to the corrals, and Ethan would lift him up to sit on the fence and watch the horses with an expression of pure delight on his chubby face. The years passed with the kind of swift grace that comes from living a full and purposeful life. James grew tall and serious, developing his mother's gift for tracking and his father's steady competence with cattle. Catherine proved to be the intellectual of the family, reading voraciously and showing a talent for figures that made her invaluable when it came to managing the ranch accounts. Thomas became the horseman Ethan had predicted, with an almost supernatural ability to work with even the most difficult animals. Ethan and Penelope grew older together, their hair silvering and their faces weathering, but the love between them never dimmed. They still rode out together whenever they could, still shared coffee and conversation in the evenings, still kissed with the passion of newlyweds even after decades of marriage. Their partnership had proven to be not just romantic but practical, a true blending of skills and strengths that made them far more effective together than either could have been alone. In 1905, when Ethan was 52 and Penelope was 44, they stood together on the porch of their home and watched the sun set over land they had claimed and improved and loved for more than 2 decades. Their children were grown now, with James managing the northern section of the ranch, Catherine married to a lawyer in Terlingua, but still helping with the books, and Thomas working as head horseman and slowly building his own string of quality stock. "You ever regret it?" Ethan asked, slipping his arm around his wife's waist. "Giving up your independence to tie yourself to me and this place?" Penelope leaned into him with the comfortable familiarity of long partnership. "Not for a single moment. You gave me something I did not even know I wanted, a home, a family, a purpose beyond mere survival. I was alone when I found you, and you made me whole." "You did the same for me," Ethan said, and kissed her temple. "I was building an empire in the wilderness because I did not know how to build a life, and you showed me the difference. Everything I have, everything I am, I owe to you." "We owe it to each other," Penelope corrected gently. "That is what marriage is, what love is. Not owing or owing, but choosing each other every single day and building something together that neither of us could have built alone." They stood in comfortable silence as the sun completed its descent, and stars began to prick out against the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed and a coyote howled, the eternal sounds of the Texas rangeland. Inside the house, they could hear Maria preparing dinner and smell the rich aroma of beef and peppers cooking. "I have been thinking," Ethan said after a while, "about what comes next. We have built something remarkable here, but I am not going to live forever, and I want to make sure it continues after I am gone." "You are not going anywhere for a long time yet," Penelope said firmly, but there was understanding in her voice. "But yes, we should think about the future. The children are ready to take on more responsibility, and they have all proven they have the skills and dedication to keep this ranch thriving." "I was thinking we could divide the ranch into sections," Ethan said. "Give each of them a piece to manage and own, but keep the core operations unified so they continue to work together. That way they each have something of their own, but the family stays connected." "That is a good plan," Penelope agreed. "And we should write it all down, make it legal and clear, so there is no confusion or fighting after we are gone. I have seen too many families torn apart by unclear inheritances." They spent the next several months working with a lawyer from El Paso to draw up the papers that would ensure their ranch and their legacy would pass smoothly to their children. It was detailed, careful work, but it gave Ethan a sense of peace to know that everything he and Penelope had built would continue long after they were gone, that their children and grandchildren would work this land and carry on the traditions they had established. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows. Dutch died peacefully in his sleep in 1908, and they buried him on a hill overlooking the rangeland he had loved, with a simple stone marker that read, "A good scout and better friend." Rodrigo retired in 1910, handing over the foreman duties to James and moving to Terlingua to live with his daughter. Maria stayed on, becoming more family than employee, and she doted on the grandchildren that began to arrive as James and later Thomas married and started families of their own. Catherine's husband died unexpectedly in 1912, leaving her a widow with 2 young children, and she returned to the ranch with them, taking over complete management of the financial operations and proving herself to be even more capable than her parents had suspected. She never remarried, claiming she was too busy and too content with her life to bother with another husband, and Ethan respected her choice while making sure she knew she would always have a home at the ranch. In 1915, when Ethan was 62 and Penelope was 54, they made a decision that surprised their children. They sold the largest section of the ranch to a corporate cattle company from Chicago, keeping only 5,000 acres around the main house and the core buildings. The sale made them wealthy beyond anything they had imagined when they started, and it freed them from the day-to-day pressures of managing such a vast operation. "I want to spend my remaining years enjoying life with you," Ethan told Penelope as they signed the papers. "We have worked hard for decades, built something remarkable, and ensured our children's futures. Now I want to travel a little, see some of the country we have never had time to visit, and mostly just enjoy being with the woman I love without always worrying about cattle and fences and water rights." Penelope smiled and took his hand. "That sounds perfect. Where should we go first?" They spent the next 5 years traveling, visiting San Francisco and Denver, taking a train to Chicago and New York, even making a trip to Boston where Ethan showed Penelope the city where he had grown up. They marveled at the changes the new century had brought. Automobiles and airplanes, electric lights and moving pictures, a world that was rapidly leaving behind the frontier they had known. But they always returned to the ranch in Texas, to the home they had built together, because that was where their hearts lived. In the spring of 1920, Ethan woke early as he always did, but this time he woke to find Penelope still sleeping beside him, her breathing slow and shallow. He knew immediately that something was wrong, and he called for help with a voice that shook with fear. The doctor came from Terlingua, but there was little he could do. Penelope had suffered a stroke in her sleep, and though she lingered for 3 more days, never regaining consciousness, Ethan knew she was already gone. He held her hand and talked to her during those final days, telling her stories of their life together, reminding her of the day they met, and the moment he first knew he loved her, thanking her for every year, every day, every moment she had given him. And when she finally slipped away peacefully on a warm May morning with her family gathered around her, Ethan felt something inside him break that he knew would never fully heal. They buried Penelope on the same hill where Dutch rested, with a marker of white marble that read "Beloved Wife, Mother, and the Best Tracker in Texas." The entire community turned out for the funeral, with cowboys and ranchers coming from hundreds of miles away to pay their respects to a woman who had been a legend in her own time. Ethan lived for another 8 years after Penelope's death, and though he remained active and engaged with his children and grandchildren, everyone who knew him understood that part of him had died with his wife. He spent his days riding the land they had claimed together, visiting the places that held memories of their life, and his evenings reading the books of poetry she had loved, hearing her voice in every line. He died quietly in his sleep in January of 1928 at the age of 75, and they buried him beside Penelope on the hill overlooking the rangeland. His marker was equally simple. Ethan Vance, rancher, husband, father. He found her and she made him whole. Their children continued to work the land, and their grandchildren after them, carrying on the traditions and values that Ethan and Penelope had established. The ranch they had built together became known throughout Texas as an example of what could be achieved through hard work, skill, and partnership. And the story of how they met became a legend passed down through generations. People would speak of the day a lone woman appeared out of nowhere and tracked what the best scouts could not, of the cowboy who saw her worth immediately and asked her to stay, of the love that grew between them through a hard winter and blossomed into a partnership that lasted a lifetime. They would speak of how Penelope could read the land like a book written just for her, and how Ethan had the wisdom to recognize that skill and the courage to offer her not charity but opportunity. They would speak of the life they built together, the children they raised, and the legacy they left behind. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew across the Texas rangeland, old cowboys would sit around fires and tell the story of the woman who could track better than any scout alive, and the man who loved her enough to ask her to stay, and how together they built something that endured long after they were gone. It was a story of love and partnership, of recognizing worth in unexpected places, of two people who found each other in the wilderness and created a home that became a haven for generations. It was a story that spoke to the best of what the West had been and what it could still become. And it was a story that, in its way, was as eternal as the land itself.